Uh, and like I said on Wednesday, or offered on Wednesday night at our Nourish event, um, one of the questions you might have as we have gone through the histories of this and looked at the theories and examined a lot of the context for those and thought about how they were constructed and what message they're pushing forth, you might be thinking to yourself, so what? Like, what do I care about all of that? Which is a legit question. But what I'm going to suggest to you, and it's a message that I try to carry in many, many ways, is that your theology matters. And it matters because it operates on you whether you pay attention to that or not. And theology is at work all around us all the time, whether we call it that or don't call it that. So, those of you who went to a No Kings protest yesterday or even saw pictures of that No Kings protest, I can't help but go to those protests or see pictures of those protests and see the signs and hear the messages. I can't help when there are campaign speeches and you listen to the candidate talk, or when there's a State of the Union address and you hear that conversation. I can't help but think of theology, what theological message is being pushed forward. I have Dr. Joe Bessler to thank and or blame for that. So what I want to suggest to you is I think that theology matters even more so in times of great tension and crisis. Whether you know it or not, there's a theological assertion being made in the highest offices. There's a Christian nationalist assertion that's being made that claims certain things about Jesus, that claims certain things about the Bible, that claims certain things about what it means to be Christian. And when you are not clear about where you stand on that, then it's harder to push back against that kind of message. In the same way that I would say, if you're not clear about what you think democracy means, like it's harder to push back when you get assertions that democracy means we control the vote and have only certain people vote. Right. So we do this work, and we come together to do this work so that we have some sense of what it, especially as we lead into this next week. Here is Holy Week. Here is sort of the critical part of the story of Christianity being laid out. And if you don't have a sense of what you think is happening with an empty tomb, that empty spot in your head can get filled. Other people will fill it for you. They'll be happy to. And they might even do so in a way that sounds really nice and doesn't ultimately end up in a good place. So not only do we think theologically about stuff, but we try to think about all of the connections to that. So what does that mean for us as we think about, this is the academic way of presenting this. Systematic theology. The way that the pieces fit together. And I'm not necessarily suggesting that you sit down with a piece of paper and you do all of those things. Some people think like that, and other people don't think like that. But just to be aware that if you're going to say that you think God is love, then that's going to impact what you think happens with an empty tomb. Going to impact what you think happens with a cross, right? What is occurring? And if you feel a sense of aversion or pushback, if you can remember when Passion of the Christ was released and you saw all the pictures of that, even if you didn't go see the film, and you felt this sort of aversion, you ought to pay attention to that and trust that. Like that's telling you something about your own theological place. What is God trying to say to you in that discomfort. This is, spoiler alert, this is how God talks to us most often, is in our discomfort, not in our comfort. Okay. So as we explored and looked at, particularly at penal substitutionary atonement, simply because that is the dominant theory out there, and it is the one that, as we've said before, that so many of us have absorbed, whether that was something we were trained in our church life, or whether we just, like me, grew up in Oklahoma and it's just in the water. You have this sort of sense of how that atonement theory, how that theology gets us to a place where we assume that we can bomb our way to peace, which is the assertion that's being made right now. Right? That violence can redeem something if we stamp this down, if we get rid of the body, if we take this person and put them in detention, if we do this thing, that will resolve this issue. A more holistic theology, or a theology in which God is love that impacts the rest of this, has us even look beyond the systemic categories, the theological categories, into thinking about, well, if to me God is love, and that is an important statement, a meaningful statement to me, then what does that say about how I feel immigration policy should be written? Right? That's the kind of level, that's the kind of impact that I hope we would actually have engagement between state and religion, which we don't very much. We don't have it at the values level. We have it at the control dogma level, which is a very different use of that. So as we think about all of these things and have moved through this process, which will be I'm not suggesting to you it's a 6-week process, or that, by the end of, good news, by the end of this class today, in a short 40 minutes, you'll have this all figured out, right? No. In fact, to be honest with you, one of Justin and I's intents as we hold these classes is that you leave with more questions than answers. Because it isn't the answers that are good, it's the questions that are good. Keep asking good questions. And though that may seem a little discombobulating, especially at a time in which things feel discombobulated quite on their own, thank you very much, having a set of good questions might surprise you at how stabilizing that can be for you as you think about what questions to ask of things. So the other thing that we wanted to leave you with today as we wrap this up is to consider that this process of thinking about what does the empty tomb mean, what does the cross mean, if there is atonement, what does that mean? That process didn't stop in the 1100s. It didn't stop with Anselm. It didn't stop with any of the Reformation ideas. It didn't even stop with penal substitutionary atonement. It went on and on and on, and has gone on in a very modern format. So people whose voices we have not heard at all, because up until this point we have heard largely Western white male voices talking about atonement. So what Justin's going to present today and help talk about is some other voices over the last 100 years or so, 100 plus years, that have approached this from a very different angle, right? And have redefined what some of these things really mean, and has shaped that in a very different way. So broadly speaking, we can call these liberation theologies. There is actually a subcategory that is liberation theology. But there's also theology from a black lens, theology from a queer lens, theology from a feminist lens, a womanist lens, all of those kinds of different lenses that are sort of out there thinking about how do they remap this. And you might be surprised, even if that is not the physical characteristic with which you identify, that the theology that is presented in that is meaningful to you in some way. So, Justin, ready in his sweater vest. Sweater vest does it for your wife.
It was either sweater vest or pearl snap today.
So Justin's going to kind of walk through some of these alternative theologies, a little broadly, but then also in their sense of atonement. And we'll have some time for questions and things like that. Okay? All right.
13 minutes, very good. Look at that. I told Chris when I came in, I said, I can go as long or as short as you need me to go today. Let's see, you guys can hear me. It's the problem with this sweater vest is it doesn't hold the mic up where I need it. Okay, so I do want to go through some different theologies. And I want to use our theological map as the way to do that. And the purpose of this, like Chris said, is just to think through. We've learned a lot about theologians and thinkers and systems that were put together a long time ago. And any theology that's put together is put together in a context, and it's trying to answer questions in the context in which it was put together. One of the things that I can thank Dr. Joe Bessler for is helping me shift my mindset away from thinking about theology as systematic. You heard Chris use that term a few weeks ago. Dr. Bessler pushed us away from using the term systematic theology. Systematic theology speaks to this idea that theology is a system that is just waiting for us to put it a puzzle waiting for us to put together, a system that is logical and rational. It's a very Enlightenment idea. Dr. Bessler, I remember, pushed us away from that because he said a systematic theology kind of assumes that there is a system, that you can put the theology together in one way and that it works, like you put together a plumbing system in one way and it all works. He encouraged us to use the term constructive theology. Theologies are constructed. They're constructed individually by each of us and by each theologian speaking in their particular context. I'm sorry, I have stuff in my throat this morning, so you have to deal with me a little bit. So what I'm presenting this morning is 4 constructed theologies. None of these, like Chris said, these are all theologies that were put together from particular social locations. None of these are my social location. I am a straight white man from Midwest America. But they've all spoken to me in various ways, especially the first one we'll talk about. I have found bits and pieces in there and ways that rethink a lot of the assumptions that I carried about the church and about Jesus and about our big topic today of atonement. Finding ideas from these constructions really helped put me down the path that ended me up here, for instance, and not at some Lutheran megachurch like I grew up in. Because as a young adult in my 20s, who grew up very religious and then in college lost all my religion, was not interested anymore, but still had that itch in the back of my head of, I do think God exists. Jesus seems pretty cool. It's just all the things around it that kind of suck. I couldn't put those things together, and these voices, some of these voices helped me do that. And my big hang-up back in the day was this idea that any God could not just create a hell and send people to hell, but construct what felt to me like this cosmic game, that like God created all of us, and God then separated from all of us, and then God said, come back to me, but to come back to me you have to run a maze. But I'm not going to give you a map, I'm not giving you the answers, you have to figure it out. And if you get it wrong, you're doomed for all eternity. And I was like, that's a really cruel cosmic game. No thank you, I will pass. But I always had this itch in the back of my head that God was out there, and God was better than that, and that I should figure out something that made more sense. And so these are some of the voices that helped me make sense of that. So I'm going to use our map, and we're going to go through these 4 theologies. I'm not going to fill in all these bubbles, but what I want to do is talk about where each theology starts, what I think they consider the center point from which they build out these other ideas. We're not going to build out an entire map. What I'm going to do is we're going to talk about that center point. We're going to talk about one or two others, and on every single one of them, we're going to talk about how that shapes their idea of atonement. So, no PowerPoint for me today, just a whiteboard. So I want to start with liberation theology. I'm sure we have all heard of liberation theology in this room. But let's talk about what liberation theology is a little bit. I have books to show you. One of my favorite things I get to do up here. Liberation theology is theology that originated in South American Catholic theologians in the 60s, particularly a group of theologians who attended a conference in 1968 known as the Medellin Conference, Medellin, Colombia. It was a conference of Latin American Catholic bishops and other ordained people, and particularly one voice that came out of that was a Peruvian priest named Gustavo Gutierrez. And coming out of that, 2 years later, he put out this book, A Theology of Liberation. If we're making a list of important theological texts in the 20th century, this is going to be like first or second. It's up there. It's a really important book. Liberation theology was a theology that was responding to an increasingly despotic and authoritarian political situation in South America as the colonial powers left. This power vacuum in a lot of these countries that brought immoral and ethical systems into place that really oppressed the vast majority of the populations. We're talking places like Colombia, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Honduras. These are all places that were important in the liberation theology thinking. El Salvador in particular sticks out in my mind. You may have heard of Bishop Oscar Romero, a very important figure. He was an El Salvadoran archbishop who was shot and killed on Palm Sunday while literally holding up the Eucharist to present it, and he was shot in his little chapel. So the animating idea behind liberation theology is this phrase, a preferential option for the poor. Gutierrez made that famous. He didn't coin it. It was coined at Medellin. But it's basically what they stated was that God picks sides. God has a preferential option for the poor and the oppressed. And so when God makes decisions about things like atonement, about what Jesus is for, about the purpose of humanity, it's always shading towards liberating the poor, liberating the oppressed. And so that we also then are called to live in a liberatory way. Our purpose is to liberate those who are not free. So, within liberation theology, this was the easiest one for me to pinpoint on this map. Within liberation theology, I think the starting point for them, and this is backed up in Gustavo's book, is Christ, and he, uses the full name Jesus Christ. They're thinking about Jesus as a person. You'll see a lot of within liberation theology, a lot of iconography of Jesus as a peasant, as a poor person living on the edges of empire, not having a lot of resources, and speaking from that situation. They start with that Jesus, and they reason out from there. And then they start thinking about, what does that say about God? And what does that say about the nature of sin? And what does that say about the nature of humanity? And specifically, what does that say then about atonement? So if we have Jesus, Christ, the liberator, at the center here, then atonement is going to be about liberation, right? Liberation theology. Atonement is going to have something to say about how people are freed from the powers. Do you remember those phrases from a couple weeks ago with Christus Victor and these powers of evil? How are people liberated and made at one with God? With this first example, what I want to take away as we go into these other 3 examples is just thinking about, as you are trying to work through what you think about the cross and atonement, identifying where your hang-up is at the beginning. Mine was this idea of hell. For liberation theologians is this idea of liberation and Jesus as an oppressed person. Figuring out what that center point is and then just working out from there towards atonement is so much better than just whole cloth starting with atonement right in the middle. Say, I'm going to figure out what atonement means. And from there, I'll decide what Jesus means. From there, I'll decide what God means. So that's liberation theology. It's kind of a starting point. Part of my presenting some of these is giving you the opportunity to then go do your own research, learn a little bit more about these different kinds of theologies, and find works and ideas and phrases and constructions that work for you. The second one I want to talk about, I'm going to move through these pretty quickly because we don't need to spend a ton of time on the details, is black theology. Black theology is pretty closely related to liberation theology, hence the name of this book, A Black Theology of Liberation. So black theology kind of emerged on the scene as an idea around the same time that liberation theologians were doing work in South America. African American theologians here in the United States were thinking about these same questions at the height of the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s. The big voice within black theology is Dr. James Cone. You may have heard that name. He wrote Black Theology of Liberation. He wrote another really fantastic book we'll talk about here in a minute titled The Cross and the Lynching Tree. That came out, actually not 2008. It was one of his last books. I will say, as a point of privilege, Dr. James Cone is a proud graduate of Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary, the same seminary I went to and that Violet went to. Actually, I got to offer a prayer at his memorial service because he died while I was at school up there. So, and just to illustrate what I don't know what the word is, sicko I am, this was the first book of theology I ever read before I ever went to seminary. Which was quite the deep end to jump into as a young white straight man who grew up in rural Kansas in a Lutheran church to then engage Dr. James Cone. Very challenging. Ideas within black theology are related to liberation theology. There is still this conversation around liberation from oppression, but through the lens of the African American community in America who dealt with slavery, dealt with Jim Crow, dealt with all the after effects up to this day. If the big idea in liberation theology was this preferential option for the poor, then I would argue the big idea in black theology, especially as Dr. Cone expounded it, was his phrase that God is black, which, writing as a theologian in 1968, I think this one came out, was a pretty controversial statement for some of the folks, especially at a place like Garrett for all of its enlightenment. Dr. Cone started from a place of asserting that first and foremost God was black, not in skin, but in affect, in that preferentiality. God identified with oppressed peoples, and in America, Dr. Cone said, that meant God identified with black people. And so then, anything that comes off of that, how we think about Jesus, how we think about the nature of sin, and again, how we think about atonement, has to start from the point that God is black. I mentioned that book a minute ago of his, The Cross and the Lynching Tree. The Cross and the Lynching Tree is essentially a text about atonement. It is Dr. Cone late in his life trying to grapple with the image of the cross. Early in his life, in this book, he's very critical of the image of the cross because of its associations with state power, with state oppression, with the use of penal power against poor and oppressed bodies. But later in life, he wanted to grapple with it, and so he wrote this book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree. And throughout the book, he's making this big comparison between the traditional image of the cross and the lynching tree in Jim Crow America in the first half of the 20th century. And he basically asserts that they are the same thing. that if the cross is what was used to impose fear and death on oppressed peoples 2,000 years ago, the lynching tree is what was used in America for a good chunk of its history. And within that, he wants to make this argument that because the cross both has that negative connotation of death, but then inevitably in the Christian story, the cross is also the locus of liberation. It is where, traditionally in Christian thought, Jesus died, and then as a result of that death, then was raised. And liberation theologians say that's the liberation that was affected from death. Dr. Cone wants to reclaim the lynching tree, not as a positive symbol, but for him, it is a starting point for a politics of community and of hope, of communities that are brought together through tragedy, the tragedy of the lynching tree, who then are spurred on in a hopeful direction to overcome the death and the oppression that that image represents. So I could go on about this all day. Dr. Cone is a fascinating, interesting figure. This book is just, it's really good. Cone, C-O-N-E. Again, if we're making a list of the 10 most important theological works of the 20th century, that's up there. It's in the top 2 or 3. Yeah.
The difference between black people and white people is their people. And
You're good. I can hear you.
hello. Okay. We were at the store yesterday. We were talking to a girl, and we had a lot in common with what she had to say. And the funny thing was, it didn't matter whether she was black or white. It was no difference. What I have to say is this. Were we taught to hate black people as young? Or because my parents said words to me that did not make me feel like they were the same as me.
Mm-hmm.
But when I got older, the knowledge that I had was they were no different.
Yeah.
They put their pants on the same, they go to school, work. The only difference is, what if it was turned around and we were criticized for our skin color?
Mm-hmm.
How would it make us feel
Yeah.
as we got older? And how would we approach people that were black that would even take the time to talk to us?
Mm-hmm.
It's very confusing.
Yeah.
And I just wondered if we were taught to hate black people, or this was a government started thing that made us rebel against the blacks.
Yeah. And I would say, like, within, the context of thinking about black theology, one of the arguments that Dr. Cone makes in here is this idea of saying that God is black, that is not a sectarian thing reserved for black people to think about. He says white people should also imagine God as black, because then it starts to change how you see your fellow human beings. If you grew up in a society or shaped by a society that at its core has white supremacy embedded in it, and thus even unconsciously you're carrying around that kind of bigotry, then starting from the point that I'm always going to assume that God is black, inevitably, again, that's the center point of your map. It changes everything else, including how you think about your fellow human beings. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, as I was growing up, I originally went to an all-white school, back in the late 60s, early 70s. I didn't actually meet, per se, anyone black other than who used to clean my grandmother's house. But I was doing, many years later, like just a few years ago, I was doing some genealogy work on my own family and found that there were a few in my family that and I mean no disrespect, but they did own slaves. But there was a very vast majority that did not, that had very little education, that had couldn't even spell the word hospital. I mean, they were that illiterate. But I got to looking into history. The majority of, the revolution, Civil War, the war between the states, they fought for the states, not so much for the, for the ownership of blacks. But and I'm very glad that they were freed. But it's just I was brought up to believe something totally against, but I don't. That's the way my parents taught me.
Yeah. A lot of us were. I mean, you made that point. Like, I grew up in rural Kansas. I can tell you there were 4 black people at my school. My entire growing up. And this was not a long time ago. I graduated in 2007. And so, yeah,
This
go
is a
ahead.
very short story,
Okay.
but it has to do with what you said about trying to imagine God as black. Can you all hear me?
Yeah, you're good.
My daughter's an ICU nurse, and some years ago she had a patient who was dying. He was a very old country white guy, and she went in to tell him goodbye because she wasn't going to come back for 3 days, and she knew he would be gone. And he said, "It's okay, Jesus has already been in the room." And she said, "Well, I'm so glad to hear that." And he said, "Jesus is not who you think. She is a black woman." This was an old white guy.
Yeah. You took us right into where we're going next. That was good. I like that. A perfect transition.
Hopefully this part of it too. Do you see, maybe starting with the 20th century, did we fundamentally move from a fear of to more of a positive instead of a negative?
Of who?
Well, of atonement, God, as fear-based as opposed to more,
Yeah, I mean, I think some people did. Obviously, there's still like that really strong fear-based strain through a lot of churches, scaring you into the pews. I can tell you, as a youth pastor, that fear-based stuff, that's a lot more effective than just come eat pizza. No, you have to be here. You're going to hell, 16-year-old. All right, so the next one I move to is feminist theology, or very closely related womanist theology. We'll talk about both a little bit. Again, this is being developed at the same time. Particularly feminist theology, as we're thinking about today, is associated with second wave feminism, so the feminism of the 60s and 70s. The primary thinker doing a lot of the work at the time was a Catholic theologian. Was a Catholic female theologian named Rosemary Radford Ruther. She wrote this book, Sexism and God Talk Toward a Feminist Theology. Again, point of privilege, she taught at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary. She was one of Dr. Cohn's professors. In this copy of Black Theology of Liberation, this is the 20th anniversary edition, his whole introduction to this book is him responding to the criticism that women are not present in this book at all. He got that criticism from Dr. Radford Ruther, who said, "I taught you." Very disappointed. So, sexism and God talk, feminist theology. What feminist theology is doing is work that I think a lot of us are familiar with, trying to break down these patriarchal systems within the Christian faith, specifically the idea of associating God with man or with maleness, trying to get away from that. So I think the starting point, well, I should say, feminist theology, a lot of the work being done on this at the start, especially Dr. Radford Ruther, was 60s and 70s. But obviously, this is still a very potent evolving area of theological inquiry, especially womanist theology, which is specifically theology for black women. A lot of really fantastic thinkers doing work right now. Karen Baker Fletcher, I'm blanking on names this morning, but doing theology for the context of black women, and then feminist theology in general doing the theology for the context of women. But again, not just for speaking to the rest of us. If liberation theology says God is an oppressed person and black theology says God is a black person, feminist theology wants us to say God, and this is important, God is male and female. We'll go beyond that here in just a minute with our next category. But feminist theology wants us to not think about God within that single gender. So the starting point, I think, for feminist theology is human beings, people. This idea that, Christianity, God, Christ, atonement, all of it, it's not just for 49% of the human population. It's for all of it. The majority is not male. So what does that mean? The technical phrase is theological anthropology. What is your theological anthropology? How do you think about people? Dr. Radford Ruther in her book, especially when she's thinking about atonement theories, was very critical of substitutionary atonement theories. This is one of her big things. She's pushed back very hard on those because of the way they glorify suffering and violence, and especially suffering that is accepted to have a atoning function. For Dr. Radford Ruther, she's thinking about that in the context of battered women. They must suffer this violence for the good of something else, for the good of the family, for the good of the church, whatever. So it's very critical of substitutionary atonements and any atonements that want to make violence the operative function of salvation. She wants to get away from that. She was also very critical of dualisms, black, white, male, female, dark and light, that kind of thing. And still had to grapple with the fact that Jesus was a dude, not a woman. And so she, I see in this book a lot of that moral exemplar atonement theory we talked about a couple weeks ago, the idea of Jesus as a prophetic or moral figure living in a certain way. And especially she emphasizes Jesus' relationship with women in the Gospels. His mother, Mary Magdalene, the women at the foot of the cross, the fact that the first person who heard the good news was a woman who went to tell it, and then the women who are active in the early church, the women named in Paul's letters, folks like Lydia, and some of those other names. Yeah. Mike's here. I don't think you need to warn other
See if it
people about
works.
dropping
It works. And I'm not going to drop the mic at the end of my talk. Right. I'm wondering whether the woman who coined the term feminist theology or any of that, if some of her own research led her back to the Celtic Christianity, which was a faction of Christianity in early times prior to the thousand-year mark, when the story of Jesus made it to that region, and instead of them making it patriarchal, they incorporated it to their own beliefs of Mother Earth in connection with nature and divine feminism, and like what you just finished talking about, they also focused on the women that were around Jesus and how he treated them. So I was wondering whether she may have had a connection to Celtic Christianity, which is also very much a divine focus.
Yeah.
But then they tried to, they did a really good job of getting rid of much of that.
Yeah. Dr. Radford Ruther, not specifically her. You'll notice on the front of her book is an Egyptian picture here. She was very interested in Near East, the Near East context of like the Middle East, the Levant, Egypt, and that thing. And the book actually starts with what she calls a midrash, where she's thinking through the experience of the Hebrew people in Egypt and women in there. So, but I'm 100% sure there are voices doing that work, thinking or exploring that tradition in Celtic Christianity. I don't know off the top of my head, but again, this is my jumping off point for you. Go find out. Come back and let us know.
Ask Chris about it.
Chris will know. Chris will know that for sure.
No, I mean, he's serious.
Yeah.
He's into spiritual.
He's very much into the Celtic Christianity.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm sorry, I don't have more of an answer for you. I wish
There
I-
is a great book called Sacred Earth, Sacred Soul.
Yes, I've heard of
Have
it.
you read that?
I haven't read it, but I've heard of this book. I know.
And since you're into the Lord of the Rings, some of the people who were connected with Celtic Christianity inspired J.R.R. Tolkien.
Yeah. Who criminally underused women in his text too, I will say, as a Tolkien head. So could have done better. Dr. Tolkien could have done better. All right, I want to do one more while we have a few more minutes here. Queer theology, much more contemporary than these other ones we're talking about. A lot of the foundational work in queer theology is happening right now. So I don't have a central figure for you because there are a lot of people doing this work as we speak. One of the textbooks I had for seminary was the Queer Bible Commentary. It's got a chapter for each book of the Bible, and each chapter is written by a different person. One name I can give you is Marcella Althus Reed. She was an Argentinian Episcopal theologian. She's not alive anymore. She just died a couple years ago. But she wrote a book in 2003 called The Queer God. That's a very important. She wrote the chapter in here on the Book of Mark. John McNeil is another voice. He was a gay Catholic Jesuit. Writing in the 60s, he wrote The Church and the Homosexual, which is a very foundational text. And in this book, Christianity, Social Tolerance, and Homosexuality by John Boswell. He also was a gay Catholic priest. That book is like a history book about the way the church has handled homosexuality throughout history. And he comes to the conclusion it's not as negative as we have been taught to think. That history is a little more positive in times way back. For instance, our dude Peter Abelard, that I talked to you guys about a couple weeks ago, plays a prominent role in that book. He's a good guy. So I want to say about our map, queer theology is this idea positing not that, they would say, it's not that God is not just male or female. God is beyond the gender binary. God is not gendered. God is all gendered. God is polygendered. And so they're doing this work thinking about inclusion of LGBTQ plus people in the church now, and how we grapple with texts that inevitably don't have good things to say about LGBTQ plus people. For whatever constructions we can do around texts like Romans 1 and the book of Leviticus, it is inevitable that they are in there, and that the tone is not great. So how do we think about theology in light of that? And it's not bad news, obviously, it's good news. I would say their theological starting point is an interesting one. It's sin, because the status of being an LGBTQ plus person for so long has been considered sinful. And so they are starting from this point of thinking about how do we reconceive the idea of sin? We've talked a little bit about that in here. We did, if you remember, way back to my first class I did, which feels like we did it in April of 2018, but it was just 6 weeks ago, of getting away from this idea of sin as a moral code, as a checklist that you have to mark off, and instead as a condition of choices that were made, that we make. This idea of idolatry, that we misdirect our worship and our attention away from that which it was properly directed towards. A lot of the work being done around those kinds of things is being done in queer theological circles. It's thinking about sin not as a condition of who you are, not as embedded in you as a person. You are not necessarily sinful because of your identifiers or any of these things. We all deal with sin because we're all imperfect, not because of who we love, not because of the color of our skin, not because of our gender, but because being a person is really hard. That's it. That's the end of it. Talking about atonement, queer theology draws on a lot of the same traditions as feminist theology. Again, trying to get away from suffering as redemptive, but queer theology being done in the context it is today, in the circles it's being done today, you'll see a lot of writing about solidarity. So atonement at oneness, not just with God, but with other people, and with other people who are oppressed, who are suffering in some way, but specifically within this circle focused on the oppression, the discrimination faced by LGBTQ folks inside and outside the church. That's it. I had those 4 that I wanted to throw at you. The purpose of that, I know that there was a lot of information in there. The purpose of that is just to show you there are folks now doing this work. And I named these 4 theologies, and we could come sit back in here 2 years from now, and I might have like 2 or 3 new ones to throw at you. Who knows what's going to come out of the future? You know, and even when I was, you know, entering seminary a bare decade ago, queer theology was a barely developed field. This book was not even out yet. So this is work that's actively being done. And the cool thing for you all about coming to a church like this is you have a lot of resources. Not to toot our horn, but me and Chris are trying to stay plugged into this. Other folks in this congregation who are in seminary or have been in seminary are doing this work. And so, like Chris said, we're not leaving you with the answers. We're leaving you with a lot of questions and a lot of folks to ask those questions with.
What do you think? A lot of us say now that Jesus died because of our sins instead of for our sins. Do we have any idea? I wonder where that really originated from.
Died for our sins?
Yeah, well, for our sins, yeah, it goes way back, you know.
Yeah.
But because of our sins is fundamentally different.
Yeah. I mean, my quick and short answer to you is both of those phrases are interpreted out of Paul. Because like Chris told us in week 1, Paul didn't have a single atonement theory. Paul was doing contextual theology in Rome and Galatia and Corinth and Thessaloniki, and he was writing for each of those communities separately. And he was thinking about atonement and Christ and all these things separately. So I mean, I think it goes all the way back. I think some of the work I tried to do that first week where we thought through the grammar around atonement was this work of like, these are like, a lot of this is semantics, a lot of this is word games. And we aren't locked in to those conceptions. The words that we use, the ways we think about this, hopefully some of what this teaches you, they are not a prison. We are not Anselm's, we are not at Anselm's mercy. We can say, no thanks, I'll pass. Julie.
So one of the things that you touched on with respect to, not this week, but another week, with respect to sin is this continent and Western European and U.S. tendency to focus on individual sin and Jesus and me kind of stuff. And I think one of the things that we have to remember is, especially with the theologies from the underside, we're talking a lot of times about communal sin, like broken systems, right? Like racism as oppression and patriarchy as oppression and all of those kinds of systems that systematically cause all of us to engage in sins of brokenness as a human people. I mean, that's why you would start with humanity, right?
Yeah.
So,
well, and I'm glad you said that, because I mean, that's, for going back where we started today, liberation theology. That's a big part of liberation theology is salvation is not individual, salvation is communal. Within these base communities of poor and oppressed people, the only way they achieve the salvation of liberation from oppression is together, not individually by themselves. Queer theology is doing that same work around this idea of solidarity as a key component of atonement, that we're only together. We're not individually working out our plan of atonement by saying the right magic words.
Going back to the queer theology, it just made me think. Mm-hmm. When I was in seminary, the first big book that came out was, I can't remember the exact title, but it's about Patrick Ching. if something about queer theology, it was just like a very basic primer at the very beginning of it.
Yeah.
And like you said, it's changed so much. There's even there's even a focus on some areas of like even just like transgender theology specifically. And it just makes me wonder how much of the boat I've missed since I didn't complete seminary.
I know it's so hard to stay up on it. It is changing. One of the things, the changing things I wanted to say, I made a little note here. I was thinking while Chris was talking earlier. One of the perspective areas I'm looking out at about these theologies is coming out of these protest movements like No Kings. I see a constructive theology being formed in there, and it's some of what I think our church has been on the leading edge of. Again, not to toot our horn, but this idea of Jesus, is Jesus a king? Do we think of Jesus as a king? What does it mean to be a king? What does it mean for how we think about what Jesus accomplished on the cross if Jesus is not a king, like the church has told us for a long time, or if Jesus was a different kind of king? That's constructive theology doing work, and that shapes, again, how we think about, for instance, atonement, and how we think about sin. Is Jesus a king who unlocks atonement for us as a king would do, and then we owe obeisance to that king? Or as we say, is it a kingdom? Is Jesus our kin? And again, are we working it out with solidarity together as a community? So work is happening now. It's exciting. I think it's exciting. I wouldn't have an office full of books if I didn't. So, any other questions, thoughts before we close?
Okay, so I always feel so ignorant around you people because I am just so lost. But I wonder, so in my mind, I wonder if this idea is just something I've made up or if there is theology around it that someone has put out there. Because I feel like we get wrapped up in this idea of sin, which is just human. You know, we are imperfect. That's all it is. It's just that we are imperfect. And that the whole purpose of atonement was God wanted relationship with us, and we're human and he's God. Yeah. And we needed something to happen to make it possible for people who are not God to be fully in relationship with God.
You say you feel ignorant. You just articulated the theory I laid out in week 2.
Okay.
You could have taught that class.
Sorry,
yeah.
and I am going to watch that video.
No, you're fine.
I probably missed that.
Not saying that to you, but like you're doing the work. Like atonement is this idea that we are separated from God. I think about sin, if I'm doing my own constructive theology, is very connected to our imperfections. We sin not because we're bad, but because we're limited creatures, and that's the flavor of life, right? If we were perfect and immortal, that'd be boring. So we're like limited creatures. We're going to make mistakes. And those mistakes, in the same way that if I make a mistake in any earthly relationship, it's going to create a rift inevitably, not because I'm trying to. That's just the nature of the push and pull of an authentic relationship. So if we make a mistake, it's going to have a little bit of a rift with how, not with God towards us, but with how we think about God. And so atonement is trying to repair that rift. But again, I think if we're going to add a phrase to our chart, it's grace. It's understanding that rift is on our side and that God is standing there ready and willing for that repair. No.
I just want to say real quick, what I've noticed with all the different liberation theologies, over time they become more and more inclusive. And so that's what the thing I like about it. It's like they're becoming more inclusive, and eventually I hope, because people putting that work out, that the church will one day adopt these things.
I mean, we kind of saw that in the progression I laid out for you there, right? Like liberation theology, oppressed peoples, black liberation theology, then we're expanding it. And then Dr. Radford criticizes Dr. Cone and says, you got to include women in there. And queer theologians say, and you got to include trans folks in there too. So yeah, it's spreading that circle wider and wider.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I just got done reading A Wrinkle in Time with my 4th and 5th graders. And before we read A Wrinkle in Time, I made them read like a little microbiography of the author. And she explained in her microbiography that writing A Wrinkle in Time was her struggle with faith. And I had not ever read that before. And so I read it again with my 5th graders, because I've read that book hundreds of times. And reading it again with my 5th graders with that lens on it, I was struggling. I was like, I don't understand the connection between
like her struggle with her faith in this book, and then you just said the struggling with the fact that our faults are our strengths, and that is literally a quote from that book. Like the main character, when she's being told what her special talent is, she says, your gift that you bring is all of your faults. And she is confused for the whole remainder of the book by what that means. And now it makes sense. Thank you.
We, yeah, no, yeah, I agree. Yeah, some people would say. We are just about out of time. I want to say a couple more things before we leave. Thanks for sticking with us through 12 sessions across 6 weeks. This was a lot. This is a lot for me. I wrote this yesterday because, man, my brain is just like, it's a little toast at this point. We are going to take 2-week break on Sunday school. No Sunday school next week. Obviously, we have the 3 worships. So we will be doing worship at this time next Sunday. We'll take off the Sunday after Easter as well to give everybody a chance to breathe a little bit. And then that means our next Sunday school class, I believe the date will be the 19th. And the plan for that is Chris is going to do a one-off, and he's going to answer your questions about his upcoming sabbatical. So, and talk a little bit about what he's doing, why he's doing this, and hopefully putting your mind at ease. After that, TBD. I'm still at work on. No, after that, I can say we'll do. One of the things I want to do while Chris is gone is get some more voices from within our church. So we're going to do. I don't have one for the specific Sunday after Chris, but I'm working on scheduling it. But I do have other ones scheduled. A series of one-off Sunday schools where folks from our church come up here and they talk about something they're engaged in. It's called Stories of Fellowship. So, for instance, to give you a couple examples. Tabitha's going to do one. She's going to talk to you about the Changemakers program that she's been part of at Hoover Elementary for 5 years, empowering kids to identify needs in their community and address them. Ken Cox is going to do one. He's going to talk about the Ignatian Spirituality program that he's been involved with for a long time. I'm trying to think of some of the other ones. Leslie Penrose from Just Hope is going to come do a retrospective on Just Hope now that it has closed its doors. I think Dr. McCallie will be with her as well. So a series of these that we'll do across the spring and summer of this year to try and get some of our own voices in this church and share all the cool things that are happening. People in this church are doing really cool stuff. And I don't know about it. I don't know about you. I don't know about everybody that's doing things. So if you have a person to suggest to me or you would like to do one, please come talk to me. It is 10 o'clock. I need to let you go. As you're going, I was going to say you can leave. The other thing you can blame Dr. Bessler for is me and Tabitha, by the way. Our first date, we went out to dinner. We walked around Boomer Lake in Stillwater. We were having a really good time, and I lived in Tulsa. She lived in Stillwater. I was like, I got to get back. I got to write a paper. She's like, yeah, I got to bake a batch of cupcakes for an event. And she was like, why don't you come over and write your paper? And so I wrote a theology paper for Dr. Joe Bessler on the theology in Jimmy Carter's inaugural address at her kitchen table the night I met her. And she wasn't like, ooh. She was like, that's cool. She proofread it for me.